Hi Pop Culture class, welcome to your first video lecture on the History of Movies unit. Let's talk about, in this video, classical Hollywood and post-classical Hollywood, so roughly 1920s through the 1950s. Okay, the first period in film history is going to be called classical Hollywood. And so let's just talk about what was going on in the country and what was going on concerning movies during each of the major decades. In the 1920s, movies are going to be characterized by two things. First is the introduction of sound to movies in 1923, so talkies become the movie that everyone wants to go see. Prior to that, any sound that was being played during a movie would have been either a pre-recorded record or it would have been live musicians playing along with what was happening on the screen. But now we can actually have music, sound effects, voices in our movies, which makes them even more popular than they had been in the past. Movies in the 1920s are the thing to do in your free time. Statistics approximate that about 110 million movie tickets were sold each week by the end of the 1920s. And so you can clearly see that if people had any disposable income to spend and any free time to do fun things, they were definitely going to the movies at least once a week, if not more than once a week, with those kinds of stats. The 1930s obviously bring us the Great Depression, which means that not as many people have the income needed to go spend their free time watching films. A third of all the movie theaters in the United States go out of business as a result of the Great Depression. And as I said, people had less money to spend on entertainment. Despite that, the statistics approximate still 60 to 80 million movie tickets a week are being sold, even in the height of the Depression. And so the reason for that probably being that movies were a way to escape our unhappy life, right? So movies provided a form of escapism from, the droll life of the Great Depression, to forget about your troubles. The other great thing about the 1930s is we see the invention of color film. Although it is on the scene now, it is way too expensive for the majority of movie studios to use. And so you're not going to see a lot of color films from the 30s. Again, just because it cost so much money to film a movie using color film. Okay, classical Hollywood would still be in existence in the early 40s as well. And so what was going on in the early 1940s? World War II. By the end of the war, you had a quarter of Hollywood enlisted to fight in the war. Famous actors like Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart were in the army. And that doesn't even count directors and producers, cameramen, lighting technicians. And so Hollywood obviously is decreasing the number of films that are generated in the 40s as a result of the war effort. Additionally, the war meant that the government, if you remember from history class, was rationing things like food and other consumer goods, and film was no different. The actual film needed to make a movie was rationed by the government through the war, and so you will see zero color films from the 1940s. Even black and white film was hard to find during the war. If you're a History Channel fan, like myself, you've maybe seen the unseen footage of World War II, and you're like, hey, why is this footage from the South Pacific in color? I didn't think color film existed back then. It did. It's just that the government owned all of it. And so some actual footage from the war is in color, but your movies weren't. The government also instituted voluntary censorship of films at this time. The government wanted to make sure that movies didn't have anything in them that would be revealing to the enemy, and most movie studios were more than willing to comply with this form of voluntary censorship. They obviously didn't want to be the reason that the enemy would have an advantage over our troops. Most of your movies in the 40s were patriotic themed. Again, if people had the time and money in the 40s to go to the movies, they wanted to feel good about their lives, and so lots of the patriotic movies had an intent of boosting morale for the people back here at home. So, when you see a classical Hollywood piece, what does it look like? What does it feel like? There's some pretty key characteristics that will identify a movie as being classical Hollywood film. The first is invisible style. Camera angles, sound recording, lighting, none of that should be noticeable to the viewer. And so we're not aware of elements of cinematography in classical Hollywood. Nowadays, we award Oscars for cinematography, but in classical Hollywood film, the invisible style was the preferred style, and cinematography is not a form of art just yet concerning filmmaking. The plot of movies during classical Hollywood films is very simple and predictable, and so they usually are, no twist endings, no surprise, shock, and awe in any of these movies. They're simple, they're feel-good movies, and they have very predictable plots and themes within them. Okay, that takes us to post-classical Hollywood, which will include the late 1940s and the 1950s. Okay, so in the late 40s, we have World War II ending. We see economic prosperity in United States. We have soldiers coming back to settle down in the suburbs and start families. This means that people have priorities and hobbies outside of going to the movies. And so in the late 1940s and 1950s, you find that film has to compete with other forms of entertainment to, keep its base as like the form of entertainment. That tends to slide a little. We also have the birth in the late 40s and early 50s of McCarthyism, which, if you remember from history class, Senator McCarthy and the House Committee on Un-American Activities was basically out to find any American that showed any communist sympathies, any sympathies towards the communist enemies from the war. Were put on this list, and so many members of Hollywood, from actors and actresses through film producers, were put on what was known as the Hollywood blacklist, meaning that they didn't have a very easy time finding work after they were accused of being a communist. Companies wouldn't hire them out of fear of being accused of sympathizing with the enemy. And so McCarthyism, not only are individuals blacklisted, but McCarthyism affects the content of movies, in that in the late 40s, early 50s, you have no controversial substance at all in movies. They're all very, cut and dry, very prim and proper, as a result of that fear of McCarthyism. We also have a Supreme Court decision in 1948 that affects movies. United States versus Paramount Pictures puts an end to block booking, which, if you remember from class, is when big movie companies like Paramount Pictures, for example, would only sell movie theaters the rights to show their movies in large groupings. And the Supreme Court ruled in the late 40s that was a violation of antitrust laws. And so you'll start to see in the 1950s more freedom for individual movie theaters to pick and choose what movies they show on a movie-by-movie basis, rather than having to only show all Paramount's movies or all Warner Brothers movies. And so that leads to a lot more variety of films being shown at various movie theaters around the country. In the 1950s, we have another Supreme Court decision that really helps movies a lot. It's often called the Miracle Decision, and it was in 1952. The Supreme Court now says that movies fall under First Amendment, and that movie makers can challenge censorship in court. And so the 1950s, we see movies finally being viewed not as strictly a business, but now being viewed as a form of art. And so you're going to see a lot of wild and awesome changes to film as a result of the Supreme Court ruling on that, and movie makers no longer fearing ramifications of questionable content as a result of the Miracle Decision. The 1950s are somewhat hard for film, and that we have the boom of television happening in the 1950s. And so now, we can invest in a television as an American family, which was somewhat pricey in the beginning. But just think, now we have free entertainment in our home versus paying to go see a movie. And so you see a slight decline in movie attendance for overall Americans as a result of TV becoming movies' big competitor. And it still is today. All right, so what do post-classical Hollywood movies look like and feel like? Well, we have some changes in methods, right? Movies don't have to fear being censored anymore, and so we see changes in the storytelling methods. The chronological timeline of the movie might be scrambled. We might have twist endings. We might see the lines between, the antagonist and the protagonist blurred, like who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. They're much more complex in storytelling in post-classical movies than they were in those classical Hollywood films. We also see a lot of films critique society, right? And question, the norms and values of our culture. So films become more cynical. They can become more pessimistic. And that has a lot to do with the fact that filmmakers didn't have to worry about government censorship as much as they did prior to the early 1940s. We also see cinematography as an art form. Crazy lighting, crazy camera angles become something that add or enhance the story being told. And we also have directors being graduates of legitimate film school. So film school becomes an academic endeavor in our culture at this time, whereas directors in classical Hollywood film usually worked up through the ranks of a movie studio. Like they started out as, a grip on a boom mic, and then worked their way up to cameraman, and then finally worked their way through the ranks to director. Not the case anymore. Directors are now kind of viewed more as independent artists and storytellers. So if you come to class, be ready to look at some examples of both classical and post-classical Hollywood films. And hopefully, if you've jotted down not only the bullets, but some of the tidbits of information I gave, you'll be able to look at a film clip and identify what period in film history that clip comes. So bring any questions that you may have to class. And as always, thanks for listening.